The rain hammered against the cracked windows of Lincoln Elementary, each drop echoing through the dimly lit hallway like a metronome counting down to failure. Marcus Thompson shuffled through the corridor, his worn sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor, shoulders hunched forward as if he could somehow make himself invisible. At 12 years old, he had already mastered the art of disappearing, of blending into the background where nobody could see his threadbare clothes or notice the way his stomach growled during lunch. His backpack, patched with duct tape in 3 different places, contained everything he owned that mattered. A dog-eared notebook filled with sketches that nobody would ever see, a broken calculator that sometimes worked if you hit it just right, and a letter from his grandmother that he read every night before falling asleep on the couch that served as his bed in their one-room apartment. The other kids streamed past him in clusters, their voices mixing into a symphony of belonging that Marcus had never been invited to join. They talked about birthday parties and video games, about family vacations and new sneakers. Their world seemed impossibly bright and full, while his felt grey and empty, like a television with the sound turned down. Mrs. Catherine Wells stood at the entrance to her classroom, greeting students with the same warm smile she had worn for 23 years of teaching. Her hair had gone silver over the decades, and laugh lines had carved themselves around her eyes. But her passion for education burned as fiercely as it had on her first day. She watched Marcus approach, noting the way he kept his head down, the careful distance he maintained from the other children. She had seen thousands of students walk through her door over the years, but something about this quiet boy tugged at her heart. Maybe it was the way he sat in the back corner, always alone, or how he never raised his hand, even when she could see the intelligence flickering in his dark eyes. There was a story hidden beneath that silence, and Catherine Wells had built her career on reading the stories that children couldn't tell themselves. Marcus slipped into his usual seat without making eye contact, pulling out his notebook and pretending to be absorbed in organizing his pencils. The morning routine was always the same. Mrs. Wells would ask questions, hands would shoot up around the room, and he would sink lower into his chair, hoping she wouldn't call on him. He had learned long ago that speaking up only invited attention, and attention brought questions he couldn't answer. The lesson began with a discussion about creative writing, about finding your voice and telling the stories that mattered to you. Mrs. Wells moved through the classroom with practiced ease, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from truly believing in what you taught. She spoke about the power of words, about how a single story could change someone's life, and Marcus found himself listening despite his determination to remain invisible. When she assigned a personal narrative about overcoming challenges, the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. How could he write about his life without revealing too much? How could he explain that his biggest challenge was simply surviving each day? That his dreams felt as distant as the stars he sometimes watched from his fire escape when sleep wouldn't come? The other students immediately began chattering about their topics. Jenny talked about learning to ride a bike after breaking her arm. David discussed his fear of public speaking and how he conquered it in the school play. Their challenges seemed so manageable, so normal. Marcus stared at his blank page, the cursor blinking like an accusation. Mrs. Wells noticed his paralysis from across the room. She had developed an instinct for recognizing the students who needed her most, the ones who carried invisible weights that threatened to crush their spirits. Moving quietly, she approached his desk and knelt beside his chair, speaking in a voice meant only for him. "Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we think nobody wants to hear," she said softly. "But I want to hear yours, Marcus. Whatever it is, however difficult, your story matters." Her words hit him like a physical force, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Nobody had ever told him his story mattered. Nobody had ever suggested that his experience, his pain, his small victories might be worth sharing. That afternoon, Marcus walked home through streets that seemed different somehow, as if Mrs. Wells's words had adjusted the lens through which he saw the world. The apartment building where he lived with his grandmother still looked tired and defeated, its brick facade crumbling like old dreams. But something inside him had shifted, a small flame of possibility that he was afraid to acknowledge, but couldn't quite extinguish. His grandmother, Rosa, was waiting with her usual worried expression. At 68, she carried the weight of raising a grandson on her social security check, of trying to fill the gaps left by parents who had disappeared into addiction and abandonment. She loved Marcus with a fierce devotion that sometimes felt more like desperation, as if loving him hard enough could somehow shield him from a world that seemed determined to break them both. She asked about his day, while stirring a pot of soup that would have to last 3 meals. Marcus hesitated, then told her about the writing assignment, about Mrs. Wells's encouragement. Rosa's face softened with a mixture of pride and concern. She had always known her grandson was special, had seen the way he devoured library books and filled margins with intricate drawings. But she also knew how the world treated boys like Marcus, boys who were poor and black and carried themselves like apologies. That night, Marcus sat at their small kitchen table, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent light that buzzed like an angry insect. He stared at the blank paper for what felt like hours, fighting the voice in his head that whispered he had nothing important to say. Finally, he began to write, the words coming slowly at first, then faster, as if a dam had burst inside him. He wrote about invisible hunger, about the way shame tasted when you couldn't afford the same lunch as your classmates. He wrote about his grandmother's hands, scarred and beautiful from decades of work, and how she sang while she cleaned other people's houses. He wrote about dreams that felt too big for his small world, about the books that took him places he might never see, about the loneliness that followed him like a shadow even in crowded rooms. The words poured out in a torrent of honesty that surprised him with its intensity. He wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, until the first pale light of dawn crept through their small window. When he finally stopped, exhausted and emotionally drained, he had filled 7 pages with his truth. At school the next morning, Marcus felt exposed, as if everyone could see the vulnerability he had committed to paper. He hesitated before turning in his assignment, his hand hovering over Mrs. Wells's desk like a bird afraid to land. She looked up at him with encouraging eyes and nodded, as if she knew exactly how much courage this small act required. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Marcus couldn't concentrate on math or science, couldn't focus on anything except the fear that he had revealed too much, that his words would be met with pity or worse, with indifference. He imagined Mrs. Wells reading his story and shaking her head, realizing that she had been wrong about him, that his life was too small and ordinary to matter. But when she handed back the assignments the following week, there was something different in the way she looked at him. She held his paper a moment longer than the others, her eyes bright with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Written across the top in her careful handwriting were the words that would change everything. Marcus, this is extraordinary. You have a gift. The comment hit him like lightning, illuminating corners of himself he hadn't known existed. A gift. Not charity or sympathy, but recognition of something valuable within him. He read the words over and over, memorizing their shape and weight, carrying them like a talisman against the doubt that had lived in his chest for so long. Mrs. Wells asked him to stay after class, and for once, Marcus didn't feel afraid of the attention. She sat across from him, her expression serious but kind, and spoke with the gravity of someone delivering important news. She told him that his writing had power, that his perspective was unique and valuable, that he had the ability to help others feel less alone through his words. She explained that she wanted to submit his story to a young writers' competition, that she believed he had a real chance of winning. The idea seemed impossible to Marcus. Kids like him didn't win competitions. They didn't get recognized or celebrated. They learned to be grateful for invisibility and to dream quietly, if they dreamed at all. But Mrs. Wells wasn't asking for his permission so much as announcing her faith in him. She had already researched the competition, already begun preparing his submission. Her confidence was so absolute, so unshakable, that it began to infect him with its certainty. Maybe, just maybe, she saw something in him that was real. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Mrs. Wells worked with him after school, helping him refine his story, teaching him about structure and voice and the craft of writing. She never once treated him like a charity case or a project. Instead, she spoke to him like a fellow writer, someone whose opinion mattered, whose creative choices deserved respect and consideration. She introduced him to authors who had written about experiences similar to his own, men and women who had transformed their pain into art, their struggles into strength. She showed him that his story wasn't shameful but powerful, not a weakness to hide, but a truth worth sharing. Under her guidance, Marcus began to see himself differently, not as a victim of circumstances, but as someone with agency, with something important to say. The other students began to notice the change in him. He sat up straighter in class, participated in discussions, offered ideas with growing confidence. Some of them were curious about his transformation, while others seemed resentful of the attention he was receiving from Mrs. Wells. Marcus felt their stares and whispers, but for the first time in his life, he didn't shrink from them. He was learning that being seen wasn't always dangerous. At home, Rosa watched her grandson's metamorphosis with wonder and worry in equal measure. She was proud of his achievements, grateful for Mrs. Wells's faith in him, but she also feared what might happen if this new hope was crushed. She had spent years protecting Marcus from disappointment, teaching him to expect less so he would hurt less. Watching him dream so boldly felt like watching him walk toward a cliff. But Mrs. Wells's confidence was contagious, and even Rosa found herself beginning to believe. She listened to Marcus read drafts of his story, watched him practice reading aloud for the competition, and felt her own dreams awakening. Maybe her grandson really was destined for something greater. Maybe all their struggles had been preparing him for this moment. The competition deadline arrived faster than anyone expected. Mrs. Wells drove Marcus to the post office herself, making the submission feel like a sacred ritual. As they dropped the envelope into the mail slot, she placed her hand on his shoulder and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just completed an important mission. The waiting period stretched endlessly. Marcus tried to focus on his other classes, on the normal rhythms of school and home, but his mind kept returning to his story, wondering where it was and who might be reading it. He imagined panels of judges dismissing his work, comparing it unfavorably to submissions from students at better schools with more advantages. The doubt crept back in, whispering that Mrs. Wells had been wrong about him. But she never wavered in her faith. Even when Marcus expressed his fears, she remained steadfast in her belief that his story would touch people, that his voice deserved to be heard. She had staked her reputation as a teacher on his potential, and that knowledge both terrified and inspired him. Someone believed in him enough to risk being wrong. 3 months after the submission, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, Mrs. Wells entered her classroom with an envelope that changed everything. Her hands were shaking as she called Marcus to her desk, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to control. The envelope bore the logo of the Young Writers Competition, and Marcus felt his heart stop as she handed it to him. His fingers trembled as he tore open the seal, his eyes struggling to focus on the words that would determine his future. Congratulations. Winner. First place. The words swam on the page like fish in a bowl, impossible to catch and hold. He read the letter 3 times before its meaning penetrated the fog of disbelief that surrounded him. Mrs. Wells was crying openly now, her composure finally cracking under the weight of her joy. She had taught thousands of students, had celebrated countless achievements, but this felt different, more personal. She had seen potential in a child whom the world had overlooked, had nurtured a talent that others might have dismissed, and now that faith had been vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. The news spread through the school like wildfire. Marcus, the quiet boy who usually faded into the background, had won a prestigious national writing competition. His story would be published in an anthology, and he would receive a scholarship that would help secure his educational future. Teachers who had barely noticed him before suddenly remembered his name, and students who had ignored him now wanted to be his friend. But the real transformation was quieter, more profound. Marcus walked taller, spoke with greater confidence, began to see possibilities where before he had seen only limitations. Mrs. Wells' belief in him had awakened something powerful within him, a sense of his own worth, that no external validation could create, but that external recognition could certainly strengthen. The award ceremony took place in the state capitol, in a grand auditorium filled with successful authors and educators. Marcus wore a suit that Mrs. Wells had helped him select, his grandmother beside him in her best dress, tears streaming down her face as her grandson walked across the stage to accept his award. The applause was thunderous, but all Marcus could hear was Mrs. Wells's voice from months earlier, telling him that his story mattered. In his acceptance speech, Marcus spoke with a poise that surprised everyone, including himself. He talked about the power of having someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. He spoke about teachers who see potential in students that others overlook, who refuse to let that potential go to waste. And he looked directly at Mrs. Wells as he said the words that would stay with her for the rest of her career. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." The years that followed brought continued success. Marcus earned a full scholarship to college, where he studied journalism and creative writing. He published articles and stories, always carrying with him the lessons he had learned in that 6th grade classroom. He spoke at schools and conferences about the transformative power of education, about the importance of recognizing potential in unexpected places. But it was the letter he wrote to Mrs. Wells on the 10th anniversary of winning the competition that captured the true impact of her faith in him. He told her about the career he had built, the lives he had touched through his writing, the confidence he carried into every new challenge. He thanked her not just for helping him win a competition, but for showing him that his voice mattered, that his story was worth telling. Mrs. Wells kept that letter in her desk drawer, pulling it out whenever she needed reminded of why she had chosen teaching as her life's work. It served as proof that sometimes the most important lessons happen not in the curriculum, but in the moments when a teacher chooses to see beyond a student's circumstances to their potential. Marcus eventually returned to his old school as a guest speaker, walking through the same hallways where he had once felt so invisible. The building hadn't changed much, but his perspective had transformed completely. He saw possibility in the shy students sitting in the back corners, potential in the kids who looked like he once had, dreams waiting to be nurtured in young people who didn't yet know their own power. He spoke to Mrs. Wells's current class about the day she had knelt beside his desk and told him that his story mattered. He watched their faces as he described the fear and hope of submitting his writing to the competition, the life-changing moment of learning he had won. Some students listened with polite attention, but others leaned forward with recognition in their eyes, seeing themselves in his story. After his presentation, a quiet girl approached him hesitantly, clutching a notebook filled with her own writing. She reminded him so much of himself at that age that his breath caught in his throat. Mrs. Wells stood nearby, watching the interaction with the same knowing smile she had worn all those years ago when she first saw potential in a boy whom others had overlooked. The cycle was beginning again, Marcus realized. Another teacher was about to change another life through the simple act of believing. Mrs. Wells took the girl's notebook with the same careful attention she had once given to his story, and Marcus knew that somewhere in those pages was a voice waiting to be heard, a dream waiting to be nurtured. As he left the school that day, Marcus reflected on the profound truth he had learned in that 6th grade classroom. Success wasn't just about talent or opportunity or even hard work. It was about having someone who believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself, someone who saw your potential even when it was buried under layers of doubt and circumstance. Mrs. Wells had given him more than encouragement or academic support. She had given him the most precious gift a teacher can offer, the knowledge that he mattered, that his voice deserved to be heard, that his dreams were worth pursuing. That gift had transformed not just his own life, but had rippled outward, touching everyone whose path he had crossed with his words and his story. The rain was falling again as Marcus walked to his car, the same steady rhythm that had accompanied so many of his childhood days at Lincoln Elementary. But now, the sound felt different, not like a countdown to failure, but like a percussion section backing the symphony of possibility that his life had become. He thought about all the students sitting in classrooms at that very moment, convinced that they were invisible, that their stories didn't matter, that their dreams were too big for their circumstances. He thought about the teachers who might be watching them, seeing potential that others missed, preparing to change lives through the radical act of believing. Somewhere in those classrooms, the next chapter of his story was being written, not by him, but by the teacher who would choose to see beyond appearances to potential, who would kneel beside a desk and whisper the words that could change everything. Your story matters. You have a gift. I believe in you. The legacy of Mrs. Wells' faith lived on in every student Marcus encouraged, every story he helped bring to light, every life he touched through his writing and speaking. She had taught him that believing in someone wasn't just an act of kindness, but a form of prophecy, a way of calling forth the potential that already existed within them. Years later, when Marcus established a foundation to support young writers from underserved communities, he named it the Catherine Wells Foundation for Emerging Voices. The plaque in the foundation's lobby bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of what he had learned in that 6th grade classroom. Every voice matters. Every story deserves to be heard. Every dreamer needs someone who believes. Mrs. Wells attended the foundation's opening ceremony, now retired, but still carrying herself with the dignity and grace that had defined her teaching career. As she cut the ribbon alongside Marcus, both of them remembered that rainy day when everything had changed, when a teacher's faith in a struggling student had set in motion a chain of events that would touch countless lives. The story that had begun with a 12-year-old boy trying to become invisible had become a testament to the power of being seen, of being believed in, of having someone refuse to let your light remain hidden under a bushel. It was proof that sometimes the smallest acts of faith can create the largest transformations, that a teacher's belief in a student can literally change the world. Marcus never forgot the lesson he learned in Mrs. Wells's classroom that day. He carried it with him through every challenge and opportunity that followed, secure in the knowledge that he mattered, that his voice deserved to be heard, that his dreams were worth pursuing. And in carrying that lesson forward, he ensured that Mrs. Wells's gift would continue to multiply, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined when she first knelt beside the desk of a boy who thought he was invisible. The rain had stopped by the time the ceremony ended, and sunlight streamed through the clouds like a benediction on the work they were beginning. Marcus and Mrs. Wells stood together on the steps of the foundation building, watching young writers stream past them into workshops and reading sessions, their notebooks and laptops filled with stories waiting to be told. It was exactly as it should be, Marcus thought. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. Somewhere in that building, another shy student was about to discover that their story mattered, that their voice deserved to be heard, that someone believed in them enough to help them find their way from invisible to unforgettable. The transformation that had begun with 5 simple words, "Your story matters, Marcus," would continue echoing through generations of students and teachers, proof that the most powerful force in education isn't curriculum or technology, but the fundamental human act of believing in someone's potential and refusing to let it go to waste. 20 years had passed since that life-changing moment in Mrs. Wells's classroom. Marcus, now a successful author and motivational speaker, stood before another group of educators at a national teaching conference. His voice carried the weight of gratitude as he shared his story. But it was what happened next that would bring tears to every eye in the auditorium. He paused mid-sentence, his voice breaking slightly as he spotted a familiar figure in the front row. Mrs. Wells, now in her 70s, sat with the same warm smile that had changed his life decades ago. Her hair was completely silver now, and time had added more lines around her eyes, but her presence still radiated the same compassionate strength that had seen potential in a broken boy. "There she is," Marcus whispered into the microphone, his composure cracking as 20 years of gratitude overwhelmed him. "The woman who saved my life is sitting right here." The audience turned to look at Mrs. Wells, who was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, trying to maintain her dignity, even as her heart swelled with pride. Marcus stepped down from the podium and walked directly to her, kneeling beside her chair, just as she had knelt beside his desk so many years ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Mrs. Wells," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but amplified by the microphone he still held. "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." She reached out and touched his face with the same gentle hands that had once guided his pencil across the page, helping him find his voice. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered back, "you were never invisible to me. You just needed someone to help you see your own light." The entire auditorium erupted in applause, but neither of them heard it. They were lost in the moment, teacher and student, connected across decades by the unbreakable bond of belief and transformation. It was the kind of scene that reminded everyone present why they had chosen education as their calling. As Marcus helped Mrs. Wells to her feet, he turned back to the audience with tears streaming down his face. His final words would be replayed on social media millions of times, shared in teacher lounges around the world, and remembered by educators whenever they doubted their impact. "Every child sitting in your classroom tomorrow is someone's Marcus," he said, his voice strong despite his tears. "Every quiet kid in the back row, every student who seems unreachable, every child who's given up on themselves, they're all waiting for their Mrs. Wells. They're waiting for you to see them, to believe in them, to refuse to let their light stay hidden." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "You have no idea whose life you might change with a single act of faith. You have no idea which student will stand on a stage 20 years from now, sharing their story of transformation because you chose to believe in them when no one else would." The silence in the auditorium was profound, broken only by the sound of tissues being pulled from purses and the quiet sniffles of educators who suddenly understood the true magnitude of their calling. They weren't just teaching subjects, they were shaping destinies, one student at a time. Marcus looked directly into the camera that was live streaming the event, knowing his words would reach teachers around the world who might be watching, might be doubting, might be wondering if they were making a difference. To every teacher watching this, every educator who's ever wondered if what you do matters, it does. You matter. Your belief in a child might be the only thing standing between them and a life of feeling invisible. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait for the ideal student. Look around your classroom and find your Marcus. Find that child who needs someone to believe in them. Kneel beside their desk, look them in the eye, and tell them their story matters. Tell them they have a gift. Tell them you believe in them. Because somewhere out there, there's a child who's given up on themselves, who's convinced they don't matter, who's trying so hard to be invisible that they're disappearing even from their own dreams. And you, yes you, might be the only person who can save them. The camera captured the faces in the audience, teachers nodding through their tears, educators pulling out their phones to text colleagues, principals making mental notes about students they needed to reach out to. The ripple effect of Marcus's words was already beginning, spreading like light breaking through darkness. As the conference ended and people began to file out, many stopped to shake Mrs. Wells's hand, to thank her not just for what she had done for Marcus, but for reminding them of the power they held in their own hands. She accepted their gratitude with the humble grace of someone who had never sought recognition, who had simply done what she believed all teachers should do. The video of Marcus's speech would go viral within hours, shared by teachers, parents, and former students around the world. Find Your Marcus became a movement, encouraging educators to look for the students who needed them most. Stories began pouring in from classrooms everywhere, teachers reaching out to quiet students, offering extra help to struggling learners, seeing potential where others saw problems. Mrs. Wells and Marcus walked out of the conference center together, their steps slow and contemplative. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and for a moment, it felt like they were walking through time itself, past and present blending into a perfect moment of connection and gratitude. "You know," Mrs. Wells said softly, "I never told you this, but you changed my life too. Teaching you reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. You gave me back my sense of purpose." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her, understanding for the first time that the gift had flowed both ways, that in saving him, she had somehow saved herself as well. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the completion of a circle that had been decades in the making. As they stood there on that sidewalk, teacher and student, mentor and mentee, two lives forever intertwined by the power of belief, the message was crystal clear. Somewhere, in a classroom not far away, another teacher was about to meet their Marcus. Another life was about to be changed by the simple, radical act of believing in someone's potential. The story wasn't ending. It was multiplying, spreading, transforming lives one student at a time. And it all started with a teacher who chose to see the invisible, to believe in the unbelievable, to change a life by simply saying, "Your story matters." Don't let another day pass without finding your Marcus. Look around your classroom, your workplace, your community. Someone is waiting for you to believe in them. Someone needs you to see their potential when they can't see it themselves. Be the person who changes everything for someone today. Because you never know, 20 years from now, they might be standing on a stage, telling the world about the day you chose to believe in them.